A massive shout out to the Jonin tier member Mr. Leroy 1998 and Jenin tier Leah Rov. Your support means a lot. If you would like your name mentioned in every video, as well as receive special perks and soon having early access to new series, consider becoming a member of this channel by hitting that join button. There's a rumor going around. If you like this video and subscribe, you will gain immortality. If you become a member, you will also never age. Hi guys, this is the next part of What If Natsu Was the Son of Acnologia? I hope you enjoy. Igneal. Emerald whispered. I see you found him. Himmel whispered, his mouth hanging slightly in shock. You knew where Acnologia went, Kindra yelled, the hood that matched her cobra-like head spreading around her neck as her snake-like tongue poked from her lips in anger. King Acnologia said, but was unpleasantly surprised when his comment stayed unnoticed. Cephas looked at Himmel as angrily as Kindra did, but the cold-headed dragon king hiding it a lot better. We should have known what this meeting was about. The shadow dragon kind hissed through clenched teeth. Adalstian nodded, his massive head moving toward Igneal, and Acnologia watched the raging queens and kings somewhat surprised by the mess. A return of a king should have been discussed with the rest of us. The Iron Dragon King, Demur yelled angrily, rising to its full height that was barely any bigger than Himmel's. Silence. Acnologia's voice was enough on its own to silence the hall, but the spike in his magic was a certain way to keep it that way. But Kindra looked at Acnologia, her mouth slightly open as she pointed with her tail at Himmel, who by now looked close to jumping out of the window. He stayed silent on the matter as I requested him to stay. Until now even he didn't know that I will bring Igneal to the island. You didn't know you'll bring Igneal to the island until 7 hours ago. Igneal let out a snicker, ignoring the twitch in Acnologia's eye as the Dragon King looked at the Fire Dragon. There was no reason for the Fire Dragon King to be nervous around the Black Dragon next to him. Why would he be? It was never even truly decided who of the two was stronger. That's not the point, Acnologia hissed as he looked at the gathered kings and queens. And the return of Fire Dragon King Igneal is not why we have gathered today, it's not. Emerald sounded surprised, and with a reason. What could have been more important? No, Acnologia said before he released a heavy sigh. If Igneal's return wasn't the most important thing on this meeting, then what on earth was? Himmel, if you will. The snowy white dragon looked at the dragon of Apocalypse, clearly scandalized. Great. Put my head on the block. I'm going to kill him, Laxus muttered before he groaned, trying to sit up in the cart, careful not to pull any more brakes or any other pulls that will send him on another hellish ride. The lightning user, slightly green in face, managed to pull himself in sitting position and looked around, trying to recognize the place he ended up in. It was a cave. Where on earth am I anyway? Is this underneath the arena? Laxus asked himself as he climbed out of the cart and looked at the railways he drove on a few moments ago, his face turning green again just at the memory. I'll have to find another way out, Laxus sighed as he looked in front of himself, the long corridor leading deeper into the cave. Since I'm here, might as well check it out. Pushing his hands into the pockets of his pants, the Dragon Slayer moved through the narrow corridors of the cave, thanking once again his enhanced senses that allowed him to see in the almost absolute darkness that surrounded him. The dust fell from the ceiling as the ground shook for a second and Laxus glanced up. I guess the battle is getting quite intense up there. Too bad I'm not there to finish it. And I have Souleater to thank for that, idiot dragon. Laxus ran a hand through his hair, trying to get rid of the dust, and sighed, looking over his shoulder for a second as he rounded the corner. I guess I could walk on the railings to get out if there's no other way. The lightning mage turned back to look in front of himself and stopped dead in his tracks, almost falling over the edge of the small cliff. The lightning mage looked at the meter-long fall and sighed before chuckling over the stupidity of his situation. He looked up to inspect the cavern he almost fell in and took a step back in shock. Holy Mavis. Mavis sneezed before rubbing her nose. Someone must be talking about me. You alright, first? Makarov asked from his spot next to her, the mug of beer in his hand as the two looked over, celebrating fairy tale mages in the Honeybone Inn. The night has fallen barely an hour ago and the 4th day was finally finished. Yay, the small blonde woman said with smile. Someone's probably talking about me. Makarov raised an eyebrow but stayed quiet. His thoughts returning to his previous dilemma. How will I pay for all this? The old master cringed as Gray jumped on the board placed on 2 barrels and yelled at the top of his lungs, barrel surfing. Needless to say, when the ice mage crashed into the wall he broke more than just 1 barrel. Today, despite everything, turned out to be pretty good, Lucy said with a smile. Levy nodded. We're finally in the lead, only by a point, Gray pointed out as he plopped down next to the two girls, missing his shirt and pants, but neither of the girls even saw the point of saying that out loud. A point is a point, Mira said with a smile as Urza drove behind her on the barrels and crashed into the wall. Indeed it is, Ultir said as she took a seat between Gray and Levi. It was quite a day, you have to admit, Jalal said as he came with a glass filled with vodka in one hand. I seriously thought Natsu would blast us all with that roar, Gray said with a laugh. Yay, we all did, I believe. Jalal laughed as well before looking around. Where is he anyway? I think he went to see how Wendy's doing, Happy commented as he and Lizana moved to the table. Carla's with him, Mira asked, slightly surprised Happy's not there if Carla was. Happy nodded with a pout. Yay. She said she wanted to be alone with Wendy for a bit. That was before Natsu went there though, so I guess her alone time was kinda interrupted. Speaking of Natsu and the fight, Urza said as she walked to them, straightening her skirt. Did anyone see Laxus? Ah, that's right, we never found out where he disappeared off to, Mira commented. Himmel stopped talking, finishing the story of what was bound to happen in only a few days' time. Why were we not informed of this before? Adalstian asked after a moment of silence. You just heard what Himmel said, Emerald said, the small dragon glaring at the stone dragon king twice her size. He didn't know that until yesterday. Correction, Kindra hissed, he knew that for 4 days, he arrived here yesterday and said what he knew to King then. Kindra, stay quiet, Acnologia hissed at the water dragon queen who bowed her head slightly, angry at being talked down to like a damn hatchling but unable to voice it. Not daring to do so. No point in angering the already angry king. We don't have much time. True, Acnologia said, and Ragnarok is taking place in the human city humans call Crocus, what are we going to do? Adalstian asked after a moment. There weren't many dragons who remembered the last Ragnarok. In the whole council only 5 kings in the council were old enough to remember that, 6 now that Ignil returned. He might be one of those 6 but that didn't mean he had any better idea of what to do than the others did. Acnologia sighed heavily. If everything goes how I planned, nothing. The hall erupted in an uproar once again as everyone voiced their opinion on the idea, obviously not liking it in the least. I forgot how loud these meetings are, Ignil muttered to Acnologia who nodded in dismay, annoyed by the noise. As I was saying, the dragons in the room quieted down again but the silence didn't return. The new Ragnarok should take place in Crocus. A place filled with humans, so? Cephas asked with a snort. With all due respect, King Acnologia, but you don't struck me as human-loving type, because I'm not, Acnologia said shortly, but in that town is a dragon I do not wish to see dead, your son. Adalstian questioned with raised eyebrow. Acnologia nodded after a second, watching the gathered dragons carefully, daring them to say something. Do not think I am doing this just because Dragon Prince is there, Acnologia said. I would go to Crocus if it was any other dragon. Humans thinned our numbers to mere 5% of what we used to be. There is barely enough dragons to fill this island and 400 years ago we filled the lands and seas below us. The dragons nodded sadly, knowing their numbers all too well. Then what is your plan? Adalstian continued in his deep voice. As far as I know Ragnarok consists of dragons fighting dragons and not just dragons fighting humans. Acnologia knew his plan but he did not know where the opposing dragons would come from. The spirits did not know that either. They just said that great darkness will fall on the human city. Himmel answered instead, Dragon King Festival will raise the ground once more, was what the spirit of the dragon said, Dragon King Festival. That's the name for Ragnarok I haven't heard in a while, Kindra muttered. People on Ishgar refer to it as such if I'm not mistaken, Emerald said. The Earth Dragon Queen was younger than the Water Dragon beside her, never seeing Ragnarok taking place with her own eyes like Kindra had. Yeses, Ignil nodded to Emerald, that is correct. I wouldn't be surprised if they were not even aware Ragnarok and Dragon King Festival were one and the same, and the plan. Cephas questioned as he looked at Acnologia, the shadow dragon focusing on the coming days, on the event he never witnessed yet knew full well what they were. Fire Dragon King Ignil and I will go to Crocus and see how much humans are aware of the danger that looms over them. Ignil nodded, confirming Acnologia's words. We will contact Dragon Prince as well while we're among humans. Dragon Prince is in Crocus. I thought he resided in the town called Magnolia, One of the dragons questioned. Yes, he does, Igneel allowed, but his magic signature is in Crocus. Some kind of wizard gathering is happening in the main city, which means, even more tourists are in the city, Adalstian realized grimly. Igneel nodded. Unlike most dragons around him, the old red-scaled dragon was a human lover, finding them fascinating more than threatening. And more people to die in the crossfire, why only Igneel and you, King? Kindra asked with raised scaly eyebrow. That's a bit too obvious, Kindra. Seriously, who taught you manners? Demur said with a smirk. Kindra bristled. I wasn't talking to you, Demur. Igneel and I are going because we are the only ones capable of blending in with humans to the point we won't be recognized as anything but human. Natsu sighed as he closed the doors behind himself after entering the infirmary. I spent almost as much time in this room as in my hotel room. The dragon didn't bother turning on the lights in the room, having almost near-perfect night vision, and there was more than enough light coming from the moon trough the window. The dragon turned his eye to the figure lying on the bed closest to the window, and the red eyes immediately caught the white exceed that was lying on the pillow near the blue head. With a short moment of concentration, Natsu's hearing adjusted to the sounds fainter than what the human ear could hear, and the sound of 2 heartbeats flowed to his ears. Both asleep, he mused as he moved toward the bed without making a sound. He pulled the chair from one corner of the room next to the bed and sat on it, resting his forehead on his interlocked fingers. The dragon looked at his sister, but didn't move his head. There were still times he would look at her, look at them, and think he was imagining things they have considered dead only a few months ago. And now, they are back just like that, like they never left. Natsu sighed. He failed them. He knew that much. He failed Wendy. She was always there for him, but when was the last time he was there for her? His eyes hardened in resolve. Yes, the moment GMG were over, the two of them are going to take a mission. Just the two of them. Like old times. A small smile played on his lips at the thought, the dragon leaning back in the uncomfortable wooden chair, his eyes slowly closing. Yes, he could sleep. He maybe failed them, but they were here. As the dragon drifted off to sleep, the sound of footsteps echoing on the marble tiles reached his ears. The sound no one else could hear. The party in Honeybone Inn was interrupted by a rather loud sound as the doors opened and crashed into the wall. The fairy tale mages quieted down to see who was at their doors and were surprised to see Laxus, panting as he leaned against the door frame. Laxus, Makarov asked as he hopped down from the bar. Where have you been? Laxus shook his head. No time to talk. Where's Souleater? Makarov's frown deepened as a sense of dread traveled down his spine. What could be so urgent? He's in the infirmary with Wendy, Mira said as she stepped forward. What's this about? Laxus nodded as he disappeared in the form of lightning, reappearing next to Gajil and grabbed his elbow. The Iron Dragon Slayer yelped in surprise as Laxus moved them out almost as quickly as he came. Panther Lily glanced at Happy and the two spread their wings flying out. Should we follow them, Master? Lucy asked after a second. Makarov blinked in surprise as he turned to Lucy. I guess not. Laxus knows what he's doing. If he needed us he would have asked us to come. I guesses. I'll go make sure everything's alright, Jalal volunteered as he disappeared using the meteor. With that said, I declare this meeting finished, Acnologia finally said, and the dragons moved out of the room, the conversation about the meeting almost instantly reaching the great hall beyond the double doors of the meeting room. It didn't take long before only 6 dragons were left. Acnologia looked at the remaining dragons with a blank face, silently wondering why they stayed behind even though he had a pretty good idea. My king, Adalstian began as he looked at Acnologia who turned his eyes toward the huge stone dragon. Are you sure it's smart that only the two of you go? I don't want to question your decisions, yet you are doing just that, Acnologia said shortly, raising his head to make himself look taller, spreading his wings slightly, obviously agitated by rudeness displayed on the other dragon's part. Adalstian nodded as he bowed his head. I am aware of that and I deeply apologize for it, but if Ragnarok is bound to happen so soon, what can 2 dragons do to stop hundreds? 3. Igneel corrected, and when all eyes turned towards him he explained. Natsu is a dragon if I'm not mistaken. Acnologia nodded as he turned back to Adalstian. And you forget who are the 2 dragons you are talking about, and I never said there would be hundreds of enemies fosses, Himmel added from behind the stone dragon king, who snorted. You haven't, but do you even know who the enemy forces are? Himmel stayed quiet as Adalstian turned back toward the 2 dragons. As I thought, We might not know where the enemy is, but there won't be hundreds of dragons we would have to fight, Acnologia said. What makes you so sure in that? Demur asked skeptically. The silver scales glinted in the light as hundreds of needle-like scales rose on his back and neck, giving the Iron Dragon King slightly hedgehog-like look. If there was a group of dragons as large as that, do you truly believe we wouldn't notice them until now? Acnologia answered with a question of his own. Kindra decided to voice her opinion. So you are guessing their numbers on pure speculations? Is there any other way? Himmel countered. Kindra rolled her eyes. No. Still, you can't just waltz in the place filled with humans and expect everything will go according to plan. Adelstian shrugged. The humans today are weak. There are only a few capable of even hurting us. And besides, they won't attack because, despite everything, they are not looking for another war with dragons. All in all, they are a rather peaceful race from what I managed to deduce. Ignil nodded in agreement along with Himmel while the other three merely rolled their eyes. Humans have always been a bit of a sore subject in the council, which was almost equally divided between human lovers and haters. Speculation or clear observation aside, their numbers are probably not larger than a dozen, Acnologia said. Anything larger than that would be noticed quite quickly. From humans or yous, why won't you tell us what you found? What could be so important? Wendy questioned as she glanced over her shoulder at the dragon prince, who was still glaring daggers at the back of lightning user's head. That you woke up, Natsu, she finished in a whisper. Laxus didn't bother turning to look back, feeling Natsu's glare without much difficulty. It's a dragon slayer thing. Something I'm sure you all will want to see, Jalal scoffed, the Iron Dragon Slayer walking few steps behind the blonde and blue head, as he pointed with his thumb at the blue-haired man behind him that walked beside the dragon prince. If it's a dragon slayer thing, what is he doing here? Jalal shrugged. Since I was in infirmary, I thought, why not? And besides, would you really deal with grumpy dragon beside me on your own? I'm not grumpy, Natsu muttered as he crossed his arms over his chest. Never heard of, let the sleeping dragons lie. I thought it was dogs, not dragons. Wendy asked, genuinely curious. That's beside the point, he's just grumpy, Happy said, keeping a blank face. If you want, I can always punch a hole trough the wall with you, Wendy. Happy cried in mock terror that was true to be told, not as much as acting is a real fear. Natsu's mean, he's always mean, Wendy said with a smirk as she patted the blue exceed, ignoring betrayed look Natsu sent her way. She smiled inwardly as she looked at the dragon behind her again, taking Carla in her arms as Happy settled on her head. She noticed ever since they came back from Tenro that Natsu was more open. More, being a strong word, since only people that knew him well before and now would know the difference. A difference that was there nonetheless. Wendy liked to think that the small circle of people that saw that was expanding. The dragon slayers seemed to be more at ease around her brother since training trip. As much as I like good insults, I am curious, Natsu spoke dryly. I do hope that whatever you're going to show us is worth all this wasted time. Laxus rolled his eyes as he pushed his hands deep into pants pockets. Believe me, it is. It was only a few more steps trough the dark corridors before the group of 8 came to a halt, the small, meter-high cliff ending the path and opening the narrow hallway into the huge cavern. We're here, Laxus said in a whisper as he jumped down, allowing the rest to see the cavern. Wendy stared at the floor, pure horror on her face before she jumped down, falling to her knees as she hit the sand bellow. This is a... Jalal gulped as he jumped next to Wendy. Natsu's red eyes widened at the sight before narrowing, a growl emitting from the back of his throat. Jalal and Exceed stayed quiet, unsure what to say, so decided not to say anything. Dragon's Graveyard, Natsu said as he jumped and walked past the 2 shocked dragon slayers. You don't think that our parents are here? Wendy asked as she glanced at Jalal, the group slowly following the dragon that walked silently around the skeletons. No, they're not. The skeletons are too old, Jalal said almost reluctantly, as if trying to convince himself more than Wendy or anyone else. You're right about that one, Natsu agreed as he knelt down next to one of the skeletons. Do you know anything about this? Jalal asked as he walked next to the dragon prince. Natsu raised to his full height and glanced at Jalal. No. Acnologia never mentioned anything of this sort. Wendy's eyes were drawn away from the skeletons that surrounded her to the dragon beside her. Is this the reason Acnologia came in Carla's vision? Will he call him here after finding this? No, Natsu wouldn't do that, not after what Acnologia did to us on Tenro. Carla looked up at Wendy, her thoughts moving along the same lines as Wendy's. So many. All these bones are dragon bones? Lily asked as he glanced up at Gajil, who nodded. What happened here? Jalal asked, looking around in morbid awe. This, as sad as it was fascinating. Wendy's eyes widened slightly as she looked at Natsu. Milky Way. Natsu's eyes widened. Of course. What are you talking about? The blue-haired wizard asked as he looked at the two. Laxus scratched his chin. That technique Natsu showed you on our training trip. It can be applied to something like this. Can you explain what you're talking about? Carla asked, looking between dragon slayers as Wendy stepped forward, speaking. Listen to the voices of dragons, connected to the river in the sky. I thought it was an attack type of magic, but maybe it's fizzes. Her eyes turned to Natsu as she gave him an irritated look. You could have been a bit more specific when explaining fizzes. Natsu's lips twitched up in a cracked smirk. Now, where's the fun in that? The small group stayed quiet before Gajil chuckled. Natsu and fun. Never thought I'd see those two connected. I still don't, Laxus replied dryly. The dragon prince shot the lightning mage the look. Care to repeat that? Laxus looked away, muttering. Not if I don't have to, so. Milky Way, Jalal asked, shaking his head in amusement. Right. Wendy nodded seriously. I'm still not clear on fizzes, Happy said, shaking his head. Carla rolled her eyes. You're never clear on anything, Happy pouted, ignoring the bark of laughter that escaped Lily next to him. Wendy smiled at the cats before explaining further. Milky Way might be a magic used to listen to the voices of the dragons who became souls. She watched as the rest processed the information, Natsu nodding beside her knowingly, seeming satisfied she realized the true purpose. So if you manage to call the spirit, we'll be able to know what happened, Laxus concluded. And maybe something about Metallicana and Grandini, Gajil offered, at which Wendy smiled and nodded. That would be nice. You lost, Master Giama stated as he gazed at the two dragon slayers kneeling before him. Sting glanced at Rogue, who had a wince fixed on his face, the pain still radiating from his crushed ribs evident even though the doctors wrapped them up nearly 4 hours ago. And that is unforgivable, Giama glared at the two. I have no words to express how deeply sorry we are, sir, Rogue said, barely managing to push the gasp out of his voice. He was far stronger than we thought he would be, Sting said, trough gritted teeth. He was toying with yous. Giama's eyes narrowed dangerously. And you toyed with Sabretooth's honor. We're. Sting quickly tried but never finished as Giama yelled, sorry. Exclamation mark. Sorry. Won't do any good now, boy. You are a disgrace. Failures. The angry master took a handful of Sting's shirt as he continued, you call yourself a mage? A dragon slayer. I call you unworthy trash. With that, the tall master of Sabretooth spat in his face and slammed him into the floor. Rogue looked at his partner, fury evident in his eyes even as his face remained neutral. The shadow user looked up at his master, ready to say something, but before he could even open his mouth, a foot connected with his stomach, just below the cracked ribs. Rogue, Frosh whispered as she watched her friend curl on the ground, blood pooling out of his mouth. You have no right to speak, trash. You are even worse than your partner. Sting jumped to his feet and moved to stand next to Rogue, helping him sit up. And what will you do now? Sting spat out suddenly, surprising the surrounding spectators. This will be good, Orge chuckled on the sides, getting an agreeing nod from Rufus, who stood next to him. Giama glowered at the blonde, who continued, caught in the moment, his eyes blazing with fury, will you kick us out? Make us take off our clothes like Yukino had to? I am starting to seriously consider it. Great. Why not? Sting growled and was pleasantly surprised when Rogue climbed up to his feet and spoke as well. Kick us out, we dare you. Sabretooth was nothing before we came along. The master growled as he glared at the raven-haired teenager. Sting nodded. If we couldn't beat the dragon prince, what hope do you have? Souleater has more sense than you do. He sees our worth. Giama's dark eyes didn't leave the two as the pressure in the room started rising. What are you saying, boy? The tall man growled dangerously. You think we would be lost without Sabretooth? Rogue spat the name. Sabretooth is not the only guild in Fury. Take off your clothes. You will feel the shame you brought on Sabretooth. Gladly, Sting said, trough gritted teeth as he took off his coat and threw it at Giama's feet. Master, surely we can work this out. The small red-furred exceed spoke up as he walked to the towering man. Giama eyed the cat with little more interest than the bug on the road. What are you? Lecter, Sting said in a warning tone. the idea of his little buddy so close to that idiot of a master, not a comforting one. Me. Lecter choked out. I'm an exceed. A member. With that the little cat-like creature lifted his vest, showing a saber-tooth insignia on his back. Why is this animal bearing the sacred saber-tooth insignia? Giamma glared at the gathered saber-tooth mages. When no one answered, Giamma's hand started glowing. If no one plans of getting rid of this pest, I'll do so myself. There was an audible squash, and Giamma looked down at his stomach, the purplish light around his hand disappearing. There was a hand pushed off his stomach, up to its elbow. The owner of the hand, the blonde dragon slayer, glared as he jerked his hand out, spraying the tiles in blood. Master of Sabertooth looked in disbelief at the gaping hole in his abdomen, sinking to his knees before his face met the cold floor. You made your last mistake, Giamma. Sting spat as he whipped his bloody hand in his jacket after picking it up from the floor where he threw it moments earlier. You wanted to hurt Lecter. Sting turned to the stunned Sabertooth mages. You have seen what I just did. Now I ask you, will you stand behind me as your new master? Or will you turn away and run like cowards I know you are? The silence was only seconds long as one of the members started chanting, Master Sting. Master Sting. The rest soon joining. A grimace passed over Minerva's lips as she watched the scene before her. She couldn't care less her father was dead. But Sting, a master, now that's something she would hardly expect. That should do it, Wendy said with a satisfied smile, looking at her work on the ground. The runes drawn in the sand with the stick circled around her for good meter in every direction, and the complicated symbols took her quite some time to remember. The blue-haired girl glanced at Natsu, who nodded approvingly. Good job, Wendy. Her smile widened for a second as she looked in front of herself, the smile quickly replaced by a serious look as her eyebrow knitted together in concentration. Everyone, please stand back, Wendy said as she knelt in the center of the drawn circle, the rest quietly moving few steps back. I call to thee, O wandering souls of dragons. Wendy raised her hands in the air. Accept my call to thee, Milky Way. The bright pillar of magic shot from the glowing circle, exploding on the stony ceiling. Wow, Gajil said quietly as he stared up. It's so pretty. Carla breathed out as Happy added, like stars. Laxus had his eyes away from the ceiling, drawn to the small wisp of light that circled around them, slowly growing larger. So you noticed, Natsu said quietly beside him, watching the wisp with that annoyingly blank face Laxus had grown accustomed to over the past month. He spent most of his time with the dragon. What is that? He asked instead. You'll see, Natsu replied as his lips twitched up for a second. There was a rumble around them, and with a small shriek of terror Happy voiced what others were seeing. The bones are moving. You sure this is safe, Wendy? I'm searching for the souls of the dragons. The lingering thoughts here are very old. I don't know if there is enough to find the... Found it. Wendy brought her hands down and clasped them together, the light exploding around her once again, illuminating the old cavern. The Sky Dragon King looked at the stone path that reached the edge of the floating island, the clouds circling underneath. Ignil and Acnologia stood at the edge, looking at the clouds below and reading themselves for the several days-long trip to Crocus. Make sure that everything is in order. We should be back in a week or two, Acnologia said, turning his head from the sight below to the white dragon, who straightened his back and approached the two, the three of them the only ones in the small clearing that was designed for sole purpose of landing, the moon shining over their heads the only light in the area. Do not worry, my king. With the return of King Ignil, maybe I'm not your right hand anymore, but I truly hope I am close second, Himmel spoke. Acnologia resisted the urge to roll his eyes at the Sky Dragon King. He was sometimes truly, he didn't have the word for it. Yes, of course, King Himmel, Ignil snickered beside them before spreading his wings, shaking them slightly to loosen them up. We should get going, wouldn't you agree, Acnologia? Acnologia nodded, spreading his feathery wings to follow Ignil as the fire dragon lifted from the ground and dived trough the clouds. The wisp of light ballooned in size before warping on itself. The surrounding fairy tale mages watched the now glowing orb in wonder as it stretched in size. Is that a soul? Lily asked in shock as the orb disappeared, leaving the cavern in blinding darkness from the sudden loss of light. The dragon slayers, unbothered by the sudden disappearance of light, watched in wonder and shock as two wings extended from the smoke. This is... A huge head exited the smoke just as the rest of the group regained their vision, blurry from the darkness but still enough to see the glinting, razor-sharp teeth only several feet away from them. The momentary silence was broken by a roar that made most of gathered people's blood run cold. The dragon rose his head and threw it backward, letting a barking sound that the others quickly recognized as laughter. Seeing humans chicken out like this cracks me out every single time. The green-scaled dragon scratched his chin as he eyed the humans before him, his eyes stopping on the pinkhead who stared coolly back at him. "You're not afraid of me, bub?" The green dragon with jagged scales questioned. Natsu's lips twitched up slightly as he spoke, his voice making the fairy tale mages gathered around them take a second look at him. "Why would I be? You are nothing but spirit." The green dragon also took another look at the dragon in human skin before letting another bark of laughter. "Interesting little brat, aren't ya?" "Depends on your point of view," Natsu said with shrug. The dragon chuckled before spreading his wings slightly, to make himself look bigger. Like that was needed. "My name is Zirconis, or the Jade Dragon." The now identified Zirconis looked around, to awaken my soul from its slumber. "That must be the work of a sky dragon. Where are they?" His eyes landed on Wendy, who had her hands still clasped together in concentration. He lowered his head to the ground to get a better look, and even as his snout came only mere 2 feet from the blue-haired girl, she didn't move. "This little thing, S.A. Sky Dragon Slayer. Well, good for ya, bub. To actually wake me up. What's going on?" Jalal asked somewhat uncertainly as he watched the dragon observe Wendy, somewhat amused. "I think I don't know." Gajil shook his head. "Would you mind telling us what happened here?" Natsu asked as he stepped closer. "We called you here because we wanted to hear the truth of what happened here," Lily added as he looked at the dragon, who eyed them carefully. "I have nothing to say to humans. Your species is too dumb to understand anyway. Leave. We're cats," Happy chimed up. "Exceeds," Carla corrected, but Happy just made a face. "Same thing, and not all of us are humans even if you ignore the cats here," Natsu said coolly just before the black and red magic pooled out of him. Fairy tale mages looked at the pinkhead in surprise as they backed away, the huge cavern shaking under the sudden rise in magical pressure that left the group gasping for breath for a second as the sound of ripping flesh and bones echoed. "You stand in the presence of the current dragon prince," Natsu spoke in his dragon form, his red eyes looking at the gaping Zirconis. "AC, Acnologia," Zirconis said after a moment, completely in shock. Natsu smiled sourly at the dragon, the smile looking rather mismatched on his scaled face. "Not quite. My father is the High King. I am just the prince. My name is Natsu Souleater." High King," Zirconis choked out. "Acnologia is a High King, yeses," Natsu replied. "Now, what happened?" I can't defy a direct order, now can I? It was over 400 years ago from now. Back then, dragons were the kings of the world, freely soaring trough the skies, dominating the lands, crossing the seas. We led quite the prosperous lives, didn't we? Everything in the world belonged to the dragons." Natsu nodded, knowing that much, while the rest didn't move, waiting with quietly to hear what happened. A cracked smirk spread over Zirconis' mouth. Humans were nothing more than food for use. The smirk disappeared, replaced by a fierce scowl. "However, a fool of a dragon appeared, and protested against our rule. He spouted nonsensical things like creating a world where dragons live in harmony with humans." "Rubbish," Zirconis sneered. A civil war broke out between those that supported and those that opposed him. "I battled as part of the opposition side. Humans should never have the same rights as we. We are stronger, smarter. If you were in the opposition, then..." Carla gulped. "I don't like humans. I hate them, thinking all high and mighty of themselves, yet not more significant than an ant. Though I don't mind having them for a meal." He let out a chuckle. "So you're talking with your food?" Gajil let out a snicker as Zirconis glared at him, muttering, "You're lucky I can't squash you right where you stand." "What happened then?" "What happened during the war?" Happy asked. "We were stuck in a stalemate." Zirconis coughed as he looked away. The battles between the dragons had already scarred and ripped apart several lands. That's when the pro-human side put their foolish plan into action. His eyes turned to look at the humans gathered before him, glaring with all intensity he could manage. "They gave the humans magic to slay dragons and had them enter the war. That's how Dragon Slayer magic began." Gajil asked in a quiet whisper, not daring to speak louder as the dragon continued, "Ignoring the Iron Dragon Slayer, the power of the Dragon Slayers made a significant change. The victory of the pro-human side would have been inevitable, if it wasn't for one small miscalculation. They had given the Dragon Slayers too much power. Those who wished for peace with the humans were also slain by their hands. Jalal gulped quietly, looking at the sickened faces of the 2 dragon slayers around him. He knew that those around him would never attack an ally, but the dragon before him didn't. Amongst them, there was a man who bathed in the blood of dragons. At this, Zirconis looked at Natsu, his voice almost shaking before it steeled again. He was the only human who didn't stand behind his kind, standing beside dragons who were fighting against humans. It took him quite some time to gain our trust, but we didn't regret it then. Not then. Bathing in the blood of his enemies and drinking it twisted the man's body, breaking his bones and tearing his skin. But he continued to fight. Was it his thirst for blood or the wish for the world to stay as it was anybody's guess. As the time passed, the man's skin became scales, his teeth fang, until his form changed into that of a dragon. Something that could not be allowed. Abomination, Zirconis said, looking at Natsu, just as you are. A human turned into a noble creature. Dragons who once fought with him now tried to bring him down, afraid of his power. The dragons resting here were all slayed by that one man. The man called himself the King of Dragons. This was the war that gave birth to that monster, the self-proclaimed king. Hence, the Dragon King Festival. He fought with you and you turned your back to him. Fools, Natsu said as he eyed the dragon, whose eyes grew wide. My father isn't self-proclaimed king anymore. The number of dragons that are left on Earth is a mere shadow of what once flew over skies, but they stand united. Human lovers and haters under one roof in Palace of Dova. That's impossible, Zirconis said in shock. Part of his mind was shocked. The numbers of his kind was reduced to the point where the rest managed to live in one place, while the other part of his mind couldn't wrap around the fact that human lovers and haters lived together. Just how horrible was the future? Zirconis shook his head, in a desperate attempt to clear his mind before looking back at Natsu. Is it any good? What? Natsu cocked his head to the side in slight confusion, not understanding what the dragon was asking. Is there order with him in charge? Is he still bitter with his former kind? There is order. There is peace. Bitter. I never really found out why, but he despises humans above all else. Natsu released a humorless chuckle. He always hoped that dragons would spread over the lands again. Zirconis nodded after a moment before nodding his head in something Natsu recognized as a small bow before turning to face the humans. I have said more than I thought I would. I bid you farewell now. Spread your wings. The last part was said as he turned to Natsu, who spoke even as the dragon disappeared in a flash of light. And fly far. The dragon prince sighed as his body shifted, the skin and bones going trough, the process he was well familiar with, the pain always present but more than bearable. That was educating, Natsu concluded as he stood in his human body before fairy tale mages. Wendy released a gasp as her hands fell down. Wendy. Carla ran to the girl. Are you alright? You are still injured from your fight with Minerva. You shouldn't do this to yourself. Wendy smiled at the cat as she stood up, dusting her knees. Don't worry, Carla. I'm fine. Just a bit tired. Thank you, Wendy. You've done us a great service. A pleasantly familiar cold hand clasped her shoulder. She looked up to see Natsu looking down at her, a small smirk playing on his lips. Something which could easily be considered a smile when he's in question. Will you call Acnologia? I mean, we found out what happened here. Yes. I believe I will still have to do that, Natsu replied as his eyes turned to the spot where the jade dragon said. A sinking feeling made its way to Wendy's stomach. But I will do that after the games are finished. No need to do that sooner, Natsu replied as he looked back at Wendy once again before stepping away from her. We won't turn into a dragon, right, Natsu? Gajil asked the dragon, who shook his head. As I said before, my father made sure I turn into one. Your dragonification is practically impossible, but not completely, Jalal asked, catching the way Natsu shaped his sentence. Nothing is sure as long as the time flows, Natsu replied with a small smirk before his face fell blank, hearing the clanking of the metal boots against the stone only seconds before the sound reached the others. Arcadios looked at the fairy tale mages gathered around him. He had to admit he was surprised when guards informed him they saw a group of mages entering the caverns, but when he found out who the mages were, his surprise all but disappeared. Souleater hadn't taken his eyes off of him since he walked towards them, and saying that it didn't scare the shit out of him would be a bare-faced lie, but he at least managed to hide it quite well, if he could say so himself. When he explained that he needed their celestial wizard, the dragon prince didn't so much as blink, but the rest visibly tensed. The Holy Knight knew quite well that if this guild wished to say no, it would be final to them and no amount of threats would help to accomplish anything other than getting his head cut off. Then again, it certainly wouldn't work well for the guild's picture, seeing as how killing a knight of his rank could very well end up with them being proclaimed dark. And as Natsu's eyes bore holes into him, he had a feeling that was the only reason the pinkhead was still willing to listen to him. Arcadios, Natsu spoke, blank eyes moving to the white-haired girl behind the knight, Yukino. You say you need our celestial wizard, but you did not say the exact reason, only that it would stop a tragedy. I don't feel overly inclined to even let you near someone from my guild since you have not felt talkative enough to share whatever it is you need. Lucifer, Jalal blinked as he looked at Natsu, an amused eyebrow raised. My guild. Natsu either ignored or didn't notice Jalal but simply continued to stare at Arcadios, who wondered how much he could actually explain to the dragon. All things considered, a wizard as strong as Souleater would certainly help with getting enough magic, considering their time was almost out and they still needed more. A thought passed Arcadios' mind and a smile stretched his lips. Yes, that could work. The group had, after all, every reason to want both dead. If we manage to accomplish what we are after, we might be able to end both Zirf and Acnologia. If it wasn't already so cold in the cavern, Arcadios would have sworn the temperature dropped even more. Fairy tale mages along with exceeds that stood behind the dragon tensed again, this time their eyes trained on Natsu, who glared at Arcadios with such ferocity the knight had a feeling he would burst into flames. And why, pray tell, would I want to help you kill my father? Natsu's voice was icy, the edge of fury in it sending a shiver down Arcadios' spine. That could have gone better, the knight concluded. Mr. Souleater, Yukino spoke as she stepped forward, fighting down the pure panic that rose in her when Natsu turned his glare on her. I am begging you to listen to us. Please, we mean your father no harm. We believed you would have wished to see Acnologia perish, so we thought. You thought wrong, Natsu cut her off. I see that now, Yukino gulped. Acnologia doesn't have to die. Arcadios nodded somewhat stupidly. Natsu did not look convinced. The knight chewed on his lower lip before he looked at the mages of fairy tale again. Follow me. He turned around and started walking but looked back after several steps when he realized no one moved from their spot. Why would we do something like that? Laxus decided to speak, the tall blonde crossing his arms over his chest. Arcadios sighed. I will show you something we call Eclipse Project. The knight was mildly surprised when he saw the dragon go from downright hostile to completely still, out of shock. His companions noticed it as well and all gave him a strange look. Brother. Wendy poked Natsu with her finger but the dragon didn't move. Did you say eclipse? Natsu allowed himself to be shocked. If Lilith was talking about this, and she without a doubt did, then these humans probably had no idea what they were dealing with. No demon or god would even consider warning him about anything humans did if it wasn't big, like really big. Yeses. Arcadios would have yelled in triumph if he wasn't afraid the mage would turn around and walk away. Lead the way. The dragon prince spoke softly as he started walking, his shocked guildmates few steps behind. Should we be worried? Gajil idly wondered. I believe we should. Fanter Lily mused. The exceed settled himself on Iron Dragon Slayer's shoulder, watching the back of the knight and pink-haired dragon. Wendy stood rooted to a spot for a good second longer than the rest, her eyes locked with Carla's. Could this have anything to do with my vision? Carla wondered, and she knew Wendy's thoughts were similar to hers. Did he tell you anything? Laxus looked at Jalal, much to blue-haired man's surprise. He tells you a lot, Jalal shrugged. He doesn't tell much to anyone. True, and with a reason. The two blinked as they looked at Natsu, who glanced at them over his shoulder, and the two smiled sheepishly, scratching the back of their heads. When Arcadios led them to the palace, it left the small group wondering just how important that project was. I advise you to start talking, Natsu spoke, looking at the knight with sharp eyes. Arcadios bit the inside of his cheek before he spoke, of course. Well, I should probably start from the beginning. The grand magic games were made as a camouflage to obtain a great amount of magic power from various wizards, so basically you've been stealing magic from every wizard that participated in this competition. Gajil drawled. That's just rude. Maybe, Arcadios agreed, but it was necessary. Eclipse, the door that can change the world. A great amount of magic is needed to build them. Almost impossible to gather in regular methods. That's why we are doing this, taking the magic from wizards, but it's still not enough. Arcadios led them in another room where Eclipse Project stood. The door, if it could even be called that, towered above them, reaching the ceiling of the room, which was no small feat. They were heavily decorated and the amount of magic rolling off of it in waves was breathtaking. When the sun and the moon intersect, open the door with 12 keys, Arcadios sounded like he was reciting, which he probably was. If you open the door, you will be able to, he paused, whatever for dramatic effect or something else was lost on the gathered mages. To travel back 400 years and defeat Zirf before he became immortal, that is the Eclipse project. The silence was deafening as 5 wizards and 3 exceeds stared at Arcadios like he grew a second head. He couldn't blame them, to be honest. No, Arcadios blinked, all eyes turning to Souleater, who was staring at the door with utter disgust. What, you heard me, Natsu snapped. Even if this really works, you would be messing with time. You can't mess with time. Jalal's eyes widened. The conversation he, Mira and Altair had with Dragon Prince coming back to him. Shit, we would save Thusans, Arcadios countered, all the lives Zirf and his demons claimed. This might be our only chance to kill the bastard. Zirf is one of the few unchangeable facts in time, Natsu tried to reason. If Zirf ceased to exist in this time, the changes would be unimaginable. You can't go back and kill someone who changed the world to this extent. You won't help us. Yukino sounded disappointed. Natsu turned towards her and she took a step back when he glared at her. No, foolish girl, I won't help you. In fact, the way he looked at the door put both Arcadios and Yukino on guard. I will. What exactly was he planning to do was left unsaid when a group of knights rushed in the room. Stop right where you are, one of the knights screamed, spear in his hands pointed at the shocked mages. 3 dragon slayers raised their hands to show they were not a threat and the exceeds soon followed. Natsu, on the other hand, continued to stand where he was, hands in the pockets of his pants. The kingdom's army. Jalal stared at the soldiers that surrounded them as quickly as possible. Arcadios stared at them, cursing under his breath. But, Wendy looked around horrified. Mr. Arcadios let us in. We didn't do anything wrong. If I had to guess, Arcadios is the one that did quite a bit, Natsu spoke softly. A short man stepped towards them, the knights moving to make the path for the richly clad human. Indeed, the man said with a nod. Minister of the Defense, what is the meaning of this? Arcadios tried to feign. The short man glared at Arcadios. I am outraged that I even need to explain myself. Spreading national top secret to outsiders. Are you a fool? They are not outsiders, Arcadios hissed. They will play an important role in this plan and you know it. What I know is my business and my business only, Minister said, lifting his chin. This matter is far above what you are allowed to do. You cannot decide this on your own, you are just trying to stop me. You were against this project from the start, and for a good reason, Arcadios glared at Natsu. Stay out of thizzes, you dragged me into it yourself, Natsu replied with a sneer. Listen to that boy, he is obviously smarter than you'll ever be. Minister screamed at Arcadios, changing history. Do you have any idea how dangerous that might be? I'm arresting you for treason against the country, Arcadios. Yukino and that girl Heartfilia as well. What? Jalal glared at the man. I can understand arresting him, but arresting Lucy? What the hell, man? Stay back, wizard, Minister spoke as several knights around him lowered their spears and pointed them at the Iron Dragon Slayer. Jalal was ready to cast a spell when a cold hand placed itself on his shoulder. The iron user was ready to hit the person that dared to stop him but stopped halfway through the punch when Red Eyes stared back. Don't use magic here, Natsu said firmly, his eyes moving to the minister. It could be dangerous, am I right? Minister stared at Natsu for a moment, unnerved by the wizard in front of him. Yeses. He finally answered. Leave in peace and we will even escort you to your inn. We're not leaving until you give up your foolish idea of arresting Lucy. She has done nothing wrong, Jalal stated finally. Mr. Fernandez, the minister addressed him. I still remember your case. You are lucky you are not placed in lowest levels of prison, so I advise you to leave before the case is reopened. Jalal's eyes widened as he tensed, taking a step back. Laxus snarled at that. Are you threatening us? Mr. Drayar, minister turned towards him. I am not threatening you. I am simply stating what I am capable of doing if you choose to resist. Then hear me out, Natsu said as he walked to the minister. Because I will also state what I will do should you choose to move against our guild. I am quite capable of razing this town to the ground and no amount of mages and weapons you possess could stop a raging dragon. Not to mention what would my father do if you actually do manage to harm me in any way. Minister's eyes widened as did the eyes that surrounded the dragon. You wouldn't dare, do you really want to test that? Natsu questioned mildly. The tense silence that followed lasted for a long minute before Minister finally spoke. Get Yukino and Arcadios. Miss Heartfilia is not needed. Eclipse cannot be activated by her alone anyway. The surrounding knights said nothing and took the two, ignoring the noise Arcadios made as he continued to scream at them. I will not forget this, Mr. Souleater. The minister glared at the dragon. I hope you won't. I don't like to repeat myself, Natsu replied as he turned around and started walking towards the exit, rest of fairy tale mages soon following. Wendy kept her eyes on Arcadios and Yukino as knights dragged them away. We should help them, she finally stated, making the group stop just in front of Castle's gate. Help who exactly? Natsu turned to look at her. Arcadios has only himself to blame, Wendy glared at the pinkhead. Oh, shut it, Laxus snickered along with Gajil while Jalal had his eyes wide in amused surprise. Natsu blinked as he looked at the short girl. If not Arcadios then Yukino at least. She didn't do anything wrong. She was just trying to help, Wendy stated. Are you serious? Makarov looked at his children that stood before him and he could very well see they were but still, changing history. That seemed a bit far-fetched even for them. Jalal nodded his head. We wouldn't be talking to you about this if we weren't, yes. Of course, Makarov sighed. Alright, is that all you know about it? No one commented on the fact Makarov's eyes were fixed on the Dragon Prince. Mostly, Natsu answered. Master. Wendy stepped forward. We were wondering if you would allow us to go and rescue Yukino out of prison. They have no right to hold her there and she might be able to tell us more about Eclipse since someone decided to keep his mouth shut. The young girl glared with all her might at her brother who only stared back, unimpressed. Makarov glanced at Natsu and sighed. Handful. All of them, Master, if I may interject. Urza stepped forward. She, along with Mavis, Mira, Altair, Lucy and Gray heard the story. Annie and Arthur, despite the fact they shouldn't have heard it, were found moments ago pressed against the door of the room. The redhead didn't wait before she continued. While I agree that Yukino could help us in a way to give us information, I don't think it's a good idea. Going against His Majesty in the middle of GMG might be dangerous. At best we'll get disqualified. Urza speaks correct, Mavis nodded. First, Makarov turned to the small blonde. If we go out of our way to save Yukino there is 60% chance we will fail. Even if we do save her without major incident there is 80% chance she won't have any useful information, Mavis said seriously. Makarov nodded but Wendy looked ready to protest. Wendy, while I'm sure Yukino is a very nice girl and all we don't really have a valid reason to risk everything just to save her, Gray said. Wendy hung her head but didn't back down. Alright, she said, but what if they use her to open the door? She knew she was playing dirty but by the way Natsu tensed she also knew she was getting somewhere. You said it yourself. Lucy decided to speak. They can't open them without me. The blonde bit the inside of her cheek as she looked at Natsu. Thanks for that by the way, Natsu shrugged but didn't say anything. They can. In fact, Natsu growled before he could stop himself attracting quite a bit more attention than he wanted at a moment. What are you talking about? Natsu. You okay? Jalal walked to the pinkhead who continued to glare at the ground. Happy looked at the dragon and a sly grin spread over his face when the dragon didn't respond and the blue exceed in a great show of bravery, or stupidity landed on dragon's head. Opening Eclipse is possible without both celestial mages. They only need great amount of magic power and 12 keys. Natsu blinked before he looked up, grabbing the blue exceed by its tail. Happy yelped in fright, his eyes widening when he realized Dragon Prince did not let his tail go. How many golden keys Yukino has? 2, I think. Why? Lucy looked at the dragon carefully. If they get Lucis they'll have all 12, it sounded almost gleeful. Where are your keys, Lucy? Natsu looked at the confused girl. The blonde reached for the keys on her belt only to find them missing. Oh, I must have left them in the room while I was taking the shower. Natsu's eye twitched and before anyone could react the hole opened in the ground beneath him and the dragon disappeared, dragging Happy who disappeared with a cry for help and Lucy after he grabbed her wrist and pulled her with them. Carla shook her head. Idiot. Fanter Lily nodded in agreement staring at the spot where Natsu stood. What was that about? Altair decided to speak first. He's acting strange, Mira agreed. That's Natsu, Gray shrugged. Natsu acts strange. Any idea where he might have gone off to? Urza asked, her eyes trained on the spot Natsu stood moments ago. Since he pulled Lucy with him probably to her room, Wendy spoke with a hand on her chin. Should we go there as well? Mira asked somewhat worriedly. Altair smirked. Afraid he'll replace you with a hot young blonde. A murderous look settled in Myra's eyes as she jumped at the time mage and the two crashed into the floor. Care to repeat that? Mira asked as she glared at the time mage. Are you saying that I'm old? You're 2 months older than me. That's what upset you. Gray's sweat dropped. Well, it's not like Natsu would really replace them, Wendy shrugged. What was that all about? Lucy asked once she stopped hanging over her window throwing up. When she didn't receive an answer, she looked around the room she shared with Urza and Juvia and found that Natsu was nowhere in the room, but the light in the bathroom was turned on. She sighed and turned around only to step on Happy, who moaned on the floor. Sorry, Happy, she apologized as she bent down and picked the blue exceed. All live, Happy muttered as the two went towards the bathroom. But you could watch where you're going. You're heavy. Lucy promptly released the exceed in her arms, who fell on the floor with a startled yelp while the blonde continued walking towards the bathroom. Damn cat. Natsu's head poked out of the bathroom, his face as blank as ever. I don't want to make you panic, but your keys are not inside. Lucy blinked before she stormed into the bathroom, her jaw falling down in shock when she looked at the shelf below Mirror where she left her keys. But I left them right there, Lucy said as she walked to the mirror. Natsu sniffed the air, his head cocking to the side, not unlike that of a dog, while the dragon listened to the sounds around them. No one is close, so whoever took the keys left some time ago. That being said, they need to put less perfume. He scrunched his nose. A female, Yukino? Lucy asked in shock. She spoke few words with the celestial stellar mage from Sabretooth a few days ago, and the girl was truly sweet. She couldn't believe she would steal her keys. No, Natsu shook his head. From what I managed to see, nothing's broken, so they had the key. The pinkhead looked at her for a moment. What, you did lock your apartment, right? Of course, Natsu shrugged. Just checking. I know where are her keys. Voice sing-songed in his head, and it took all Natsu's willpower not to growl in annoyance. Where? Pray tell. I don't think I will, it said mockingly. Unless you allow me to move that body of yours. It would make my job quite a bit easier. And why would I make your job easier? Natsu. Lucy looked at the dragon that stared in front of himself with a blank face, a small frown on his face. Natsu blinked, his concentration returning to Lucy. He cleared his throat in order to break the silence that settled between them when he didn't answer for too long. Yes, he finally said. You kinda spaced out, Happy replied, the small exceed flying in front of his face. What were you thinking about? Nothing. The dragon deadpanned. We should get back to Master and first and tell them what happened. Lucy nodded, her eyes back on the place she left her keys. They will try to activate Eclipse now, won't they? Natsu nodded. Yes. They never needed 2 mages. They need only 1, but they needed all 12 keys, which they now have. I'm such an idiot. Lucy stomped her foot against the floor, a frustrated sound leaving her lips. Natsu stayed quiet, unsure what exactly to say to that, because, yes, didn't seem quite appropriate. Crocus was, without a doubt, just as beautiful at night as it was during the day, so it was no real surprise the streets were crowded in the early evening after the sun went down. Mages from all around Fury along with regular people were gathered in the blooming capital during this time of year, and no person could look too strange, and that was exactly what particular duo was grateful for as much as they hated the overly crowded streets. One was a red-haired man, slightly taller than his companion. His shoulder-length hair spiky and loose, resting on a black coat which was the only thing covering his upper body since the man missed the shirt. Red, knee-length pants with golden trim hung around his waist, and black sandals covered his feet. His tanned skin was stretched over well-formed muscles, the lean body covered in quite a number of scars. The man beside him stood barely an inch shorter than his friend. Long white hair reached to his lower back, wild and untamed. Black coat hung on his bare shoulders similar to his friend's, but his skin darker. Blue markings covered his arms and face. Black baggy pants were tucked in gray boots, silver sash warped around his waist. Redhead scratched his chin, fingers tracing the neat goatee. So this is Crocus. That's what was written above the gates, white-haired one replied, his piercing blue eyes glancing at his companion. I don't like this crowd. Who does? Redhead shrugged. You think we'll find him here? From what I managed to gather, my son is in this town, White-haired replied with a sniff. Bastard didn't bother to tell me himself. I don't really see the problem. Of course, you don't, Igneel. You're not the one that needs to prepare a meeting every year only for your own son to not show up. I don't have a son, Acnologia, Igneel grinned, gold eyes turning to look at the Dragon King in human form beside him. And you're damn lucky, Acnologia grumbled, earning a chuckle from Igneel. So, where should we head to? I can't really smell much in this crowd, Igneel continued, his hands finding their way in his pants pockets. Acnologia looked around. I haven't been properly in a human city since I became dragon, so. Tallest building available. Properly. Igneel raised an eyebrow. What's that supposed to mean? Acnologia stayed quiet after that, his face turning perfectly blank. Acnologia. Igneel sighed in exasperation. Idiot. The Fire Dragon King soon yelped in surprise when Acnologia elbowed him in ribs. Show some respect. Acnologia grumbled. You're talking to your king. King my asses. Igneel evaded the next hit, a grin on his face showing the sharp canines. Wouldn't the tallest building be the castle of their king? Igneel returned to the previous topic. Natsu might be prince of dragons, but he is no prince of theirs, Acnologia shrugged. What do you suggest we do then? Oh, wise one. His voice dripped with sarcasm as he gave Igneel a dry look. No need for flattery, my loyal subject, Igneel replied with a grin, tipping his chin up in a joke. I would suggest you stop with lousy jokes or I just might rip your head off, like you would do something like that. Igneel's grin didn't disappear even when Acnologia's glare intensified. But seriously now, you said Natsu's in Grand Magic Games, whatever that was, and that would be in some kind of arena, wouldn't it? Acnologia nodded for a moment. So we're looking for an arena and not the tallest building in the city. Something like that, Igneel agreed. Or we could always ask around and see if humans around here knows where he is. Acnologia glanced at Igneel, eyebrow raised. To ask humans for help. Me. Igneel rolled his eyes at that. Prick. The fire dragon scoffed. Idiot. Acnologia bit back. The two continued on in silence for a while before Igneel suddenly stopped two girls that walked past them. Hey, ladies, he said, a smirk on his face that widened when the girls blushed. Acnologia stared at them for a moment before he sent the fire dragon a glare. You wouldn't mind helping us for a moment? Igneel continued, completely ignoring his high king. Sure thing. One of the girls replied after a moment, a smile on her face as well. Two hunks like you sure deserve any help we could give you. Acnologia blinked at the girl before he turned to Igneel, who grinned. You see, we're looking for someone, Igneel began. Heard of Natsu? He glanced at Acnologia, who supplied. Souleater, have you heard of Natsu Souleater? Igneel repeated, his grin turning into a small frown when the two girls looked at them with wide eyes. As if Natsu Souleater, a freaking dragon of fairy tale, one asked. Dragon, nothing freakish about him, Igneel replied, confused at their reaction. Acnologia sighed while the girls looked ready to faint. Inform my friend and me where he is and you just might leave in one piece, Acnologia informed them. The girls yelped, answering in union, Honeybone Inn, before sprinting off. Igneel frowned. That was uncalled for. Acnologia gave him a dry look before he continued walking towards the general direction the girls pointed at. Hunks. The High King muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. Once they got directions, finding the Honeybone Inn was surprisingly easy, and the level of noise coming from the inside helped quite a bit when they asked another man, who answered with, search for the loudest place, think he'll be happy to see you. Igneel asked when they reached the doors. Acnologia shrugged. Ask me if I care, and fairy tale in general. You did blast them to oblivion for 7 years, Acnologia looked at Igneel. How do you know about that? Just because I was away from you doesn't mean I was away from society, Igneel replied with a smirk. Acnologia sighed before he stepped forward and opened the doors. The High King looked at the scene before him with a blank look, hiding the shocked expression with practiced ease. Was his son in this guild? The chairs that flew along with people in it were anything but a fancy sight to see. He was expecting something a bit more controlled. This looks like a party, Igneel peeked over his shoulder. Yes, it does, Acnologia replied dryly as the two stepped forward, unnoticed by the mages around them. Can you see him? Igneel asked, looking around for pink hair. His eyes stopped on one, but he quickly realized that he was looking at a girl, so his eyes continued their search. No, he is close, though. The scent is strong, Acnologia said quietly. A mage ran past them, accidentally bumping into Igneel. Sorry, man, the dark-haired teen said quickly but stopped before he could get too far when he realized he did not recognize him. And you are, Igneel smiled, a friend of the Dragon Prince. Heard he should be around here somewhere. Teen stared at them with wide eyes for a moment before he swallowed and looked around. He's in the back with Master. His eyes traveled to Acnologia. But if you don't mind, I'll call him here and you wait outside. Igneel blinked for a moment before nodding as two dragons stepped outside. Now that's rude, Igneel muttered, his golden eyes on the teen who ran to wherever the Master was. I always told you humans have no manners whatsoever. Rude as a whole, that kind, Acnologia scoffed. You were once human, Igneel pointed out, earning a growl from his king. Worst years of my life, Acnologia grounded out. A sound of footsteps rushed towards them and a small man, barely reaching Acnologia's hips, stepped outside, and it took Acnologia only a moment to recognize the man despite seeing him only once. Makarov, Acnologia said after a moment. Makarov's frown deepened, his eyes looking from him to Igneel. A moment later the idiot of his son stepped out, stopping dead in his tracks when he saw the two. Natsu, you know these two? Dark-haired teen from before asked, looking at Pinkhead before turning back to the two strangers. Natsu stayed silent, his eyes moving from Acnologia to Igneel, disbelief flashing in red orbs. His eyes finally settled on Acnologia, and the Dragon Prince bowed his head in a small gesture that both humans at his side noticed, and while Gray stayed puzzled, a sinking revelation appeared in Makarov's mind. No way, Makarov whispered, his fist clenching. Master, what is going on? Altair stepped out and looked at the three dragons, noting the awkward silence between them while Jalal and Mira walked behind her. I am surprised to see you here, Natsu finally managed. I imagine you're quite angry since I missed yearly gathering, but I couldn't postpone the happenings here. Group stared at the Dragon Prince in surprise, but it only took those who were on Tenro a moment to realize who stood in front of them. Should we be worried? Gray asked uncertainly. I already am, Mira admitted. Who's the other one? Altair whispered, not really expecting the answer to come from the red-haired man beside Acnologia. Little human, before you stands Igneel, Fire Dragon King, and Acnologia is here right hand since last week. I am sure you understand why we're not thrilled with you being here. Makarov glared at Acnologia, who nodded. I have a few IDs, why are you here? Natsu asked, his voice blank but the impatience clear. Igneel frowned before he spoke in mock hurt. Not even a hello for your favorite fire dragon. I'm deeply hurt. Hello, Natsu deadpanned, red eyes meeting golden for a moment before he looked at Acnologia. Igneel's eye twitched and an amused smirk lifted Acnologia's lips for a moment. Now if you don't mind me repeating the question, why are you here? Natsu looked at the two. We would like to discuss this in private, Acnologia spoke after a moment, and Natsu nodded immediately. Of course, wait, you can't just go away like that, Mira protested angrily. And why not? Acnologia gazed at her. The tense silence lasted only a second longer when Wendy stepped outside, Gajil and Laxus behind her. Natsu? She spoke softly. Yes, Wendy. Natsu looked at small dragon slayer. She was white as a sheet when her eyes settled on Acnologia. I would recognize that smell anywhere, Gajil sneered. Where are your wings, bastard? Acnologia scoffed. I would watch my tongue if I were you, human. I can still kill you before you could blink. You won't kill anyone, father, Natsu said, the Dragon Prince stepping in front of Acnologia, blocking his view of the Iron Dragon Slayer. Especially not those I trained. You trained them. Acnologia raised an eyebrow. Either you've done a very poor job or they are really crappy students. Hey! Laxus shouted angrily. I have trained them for only a few weeks, but they are by no means crappy. Jalal blinked, his eyes on Gajil, who stood next to him. Did he just gave you a compliment? That being said, Natsu continued quickly. We will leave somewhere where we can be alone. I have a few questions of my own that need to be answered. He pointedly looked at Igneel. Agreed, Acnologia said as he straightened his back. Natsu walked closer and Acnologia's hand grasped his shoulder before the two disappeared into chaotic void, this time opened by Acnologia. Igneel blinked when they disappeared before shaking his head. Bastard, he muttered, stopping when he realized everyone was staring at him. Well, nice meeting you all. The Fire Dragon King smiled awkwardly before he gave a half wave and disappeared in a swirl of flames. You think there is some cool way of disappearing like that using the iron? Gajeel wondered out loud when dragons left. Makarov shook his head and entered back in the inn. The information Natsu and Lucy shared with them and disappearance of her keys were something to be worried about, and the arrival of Acnologia did not help them at all. Wendy stared at empty street another moment longer, barely noticing when Carla landed on her head. Do you think that what you saw in your vision will really happen? Carla sighed. Everything I saw and heard so far leads to that, so Acnologia will die. Most likely. Did you say just Acnologia will die? Carla and Wendy tensed, slowly turning around to face Jalal, who stared at the two with wide eyes. We thought that you were alone, Jalal asked, eyes narrowing. You were, but I went to see if everything was alright with you since you two stayed behind. Look. Jalal. Wendy bit her lower lip. You were lying to Natsu, it wasn't a question. No. Wendy twisted her fingers. I just didn't tell him the whole truth, Wendy. Jalal shook his head. Who else knows about this? The girl stayed quiet for a while, and when Jalal was about to lose any semblance of patience he had left, she answered. Full story, no, only Master and Perliuzica, though I believe Master told first as well. Of course. Jalal shook his head before he turned on his heel and stomped off towards Master, who settled himself on the bar. Wendy, once again left alone outside, choked before a sob escaped her lips, and she ran to catch the blue-haired wizard grabbing his wrist. Please let me explain, she sobbed out. Jalal looked at her, anger quickly changing into sadness. Why didn't you tell Natsu? Natsu stared at his father. The two stood on the roof of one of the many buildings in Crocus, a not-so-busy street below the house. He might hide the fact he was shocked quite well, but that did not change it. Seeing his father in human's body was something he thought he would never see. The scent was his, but getting used to a figure that was not towering over him but actually an inch or two shorter will take some time getting used to. Two stayed silent until fire burst beside Acnologia and Igneel appeared. I guess we have some explaining to do, Igneel grinned, scratching the back of his head. You could start with answering why are you here, Natsu offered. Acnologia sighed. I asked him to come, I can see that. I doubt he would be here if you didn't, Natsu shot back. Igneel shook his head. You, kid, or worse than I remember, Natsu looked at Igneel. And the meaning behind that? Forget it, I don't think I can. Were you referring to my skills? No, Igneel shook his head. Never mind that. The reason Acnologia went to find me was because, he took a deep breath. Ragnarok will start soon, like any day now soon. Natsu tensed, clenching his jaw while his eyes fixed on the two, wide in surprise. Ragnarok, you mean Dragon King Festival? Igneel and Acnologia stared at him. You know about it? Acnologia finally asked. Natsu nodded, reluctantly as it was. Wendy, the Sky Dragon Slayer of our guild, used Milky Way to speak with a spirit of a dragon that resided on the graveyard underneath Arena. Maybe one of the spirits Himmel spoke to, Igneel mused, turning to Acnologia, who nodded absently. How long do you know about that? The Dragon King's eyes narrowed as he looked at Natsu. Natsu blinked at the accusing tone. Since a few hours ago. I was going to tell you what will happen as soon as I got the chance. Acnologia stayed tense for another moment before relaxing slightly. Will Himmel and others be here? Natsu asked. Once it starts, he added after a moment. They shouldn't be, Acnologia said. I told them to stay on the island. Two of us along with you are more than enough for a dozen or so dragons. Natsu stared at High King for a while before he spoke again. I hope you don't mind me asking, but I will not ask your permission. How do you know how many there will be? Igneel snickered at Acnologia's rather obvious annoyance. A guess, really, Igneel replied instead of Acnologia. There couldn't be a group of dragons bigger than that without us noticing. Dragon Prince nodded in agreement. That sounds right. So, is there a plan I should be aware of? Natsu asked, his eyes on Igneel, who sat on the narrow roof and crossed his legs, Acnologia following suit. There is, Acnologia, but not a well-planned plan. He grimaced at the unfortunate choice of words. We are not sure what we are dealing with or who our enemies are, and that's leaving us with extremely limited number of things we can do. Natsu nodded in agreement before he crunched beside the two just as a couple passed on the street below. I will patrol the area tonight while Igneel and you stay inside of town, Acnologia instructed. And if someone attacks, you attack as well, kill. Why are you asking stupid questions, Natsu? I apologize. Natsu looked back at the street. Your magic is hidden. Why? Dragon Prince asked after a moment of silence stretched too long. We are trying to stay unnoticed, Igneel stated. If we let our magic flow freely we would definitely be noticed. It was quite logical, really. Another stupid question. Acnologia stood suddenly. I'll take my leave now. Keep your eyes open. Natsu nodded before he bowed his head, a barely visible nod of his head but the most he gave anyone. Igneel gave a half wave as Acnologia jumped from the roof into a nearby ally and disappeared in the dark. Igneel looked at young dragon beside him with a grin which Natsu returned with a small twitch of his lips into a smile before it fell down. It's good to see you, uncle, Natsu said after a moment. Igneel's grin widened. It's good to see you too, kid. I see you still hold onto that scarf I gave you, Natsu nodded, fingering the edge of the scarf around his neck absently. It would be incredibly rude on my part to throw away a gift, he asked you not to tell him. Jalal repeated after Wendy who nodded slowly. And what is his so brilliant reason? Jalal hissed through gritted teeth. Wendy twisted her fingers in a show of uneasiness that tied the knot in her throat. He wants him dead. Jalal's eyes widened in shock. He was one of the few people in fairy tale who weren't very familiar with Makarov and for him, Mira was the master of fairy tale. The old man was a great man and powerful wizard, that went without a doubt but he never really managed to earn his trust nor did Makarov earn his. And if Natsu warns him Acnologia might not come, Jalal nodded in realization. Wendy nodded, yes, but you have to understand. What Acnologia did to us is horrible. He took 7 years of our life away from us. Away from you, Jalal rubbed his temple. I can understand you being angry, but to not say something like that to Natsu. That's just wrong. I'm sorry but I can't just not tell him that. Wendy's eyes widened in horror. No, she yelled then clamped her hands over her mouth. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to yell. You can't tell him. If you tell him I lied to him he will hate me. You should have thought of it before, Jalal stated. Wendy stared at blue-haired mage in shock but Carla was just furious. How dare you? The small cat screamed. She was only doing what she thought was best. What master told her to do. You can't blame her for staying silent. Carla, Wendy whispered before she turned to Jalal, locking her eyes with his. I'm sorry Jalal, I truly am, but I have to ask you to stay silent. I will tell him what happened myself. Jalal looked skeptical and stared at the young girl before him for a long moment before finally nodding. Alright, but you have to tell him tonight, Jalal concluded. Wendy gave him a tiny smile which Jalal returned. Now, let's go back inside and wait for him to come back. Don't think I won't be watching you, Wendy bowed low. Thank you, Jalal, thank you. Jalal waved his hands through the air. You don't have to thank me. I should apologize though. It's not just your fault and I blamed you for it, Wendy shook her head. No, apologies are not necessary. Jalal smiled at her and turned around. You wanna eat something? We could. Jalal stopped mid-sentence when a tiny hand touched the back of his head, the bluish glow coming from the tips of Wendy's fingers. Wendy, Carla gasped when Wendy pulled her head back, white line retreating back with her fingers before the small dragon slayer waved her fingers through the air and the thread disappeared. Jalal's eyes glazed over and ex-dark mage stared blankly in front of himself. What did you do? Carla hissed at the girl whose cheeks were stained with the tears that now flew freely. Wendy shook her head. I didn't want to do that. I promised I would never use it on a friend. What did you do? Carla repeated. Natsu taught me that on the training trip, Wendy explained. Dragon Slayer secret art. Silver theft. Carla blinked, not understanding. I stole his memories of this conversation. He will never remember it, Wendy stated. Carla truly hated herself at the moment and as much as she tried to convince herself she had no reason to, she couldn't help it. She often wondered why her visions were always announcing bad things. White Exceed also wondered why did she ever say what she saw to Makarov and not Natsu. It wouldn't be easier but the dragon would definitely have a better idea of what to do rather than sit and wait, that Makarov suggested. Carla sighed shaking her head. The city was practically abandoned even though it was the middle of the day. Everyone was in the stadium or in their homes watching the games and those that weren't watching them probably wished they were. Well, not all of them. Carla and her little group had their eyes set on completely different goal, watching the game the last they wanted to do at the moment but the relaxing aspect of it might be more welcome than this. You okay? Happy asked her, looking at her worriedly. Fanter Lily agreed with Happy. You've been quiet for a long time. I'm fine, Carla assured them, her eyes moving from Happy and Lily to their surroundings and rest of companions. Altair glanced at them over her shoulder while Gajiel, Arthur, and Annie continued their walk. Don't get me wrong, Arthur started, the group of 5 making their way towards the castle. But why exactly are you here? He turned to Exceeds. To help, of course. Happy sounded offended. We can be useful, he assured Shadow User. Of course, Arthur did not sound convinced. Guys. Don't forget why we're here, Altair reminded them. We need to find Lucis Keys and take Yukino as soon as possible. The longer we take, the chances of Eclipse project being successful are bigger. Natsu and others are counting on us and we sure as hell won't let them down. How are we gonna enter the castle anyway? Gajiel questioned. People will recognize our faces in a second. And I doubt guards will just let us waltz in, especially after they saw me and Exceeds yesterday, Annie grinned. You think I'm here just because I'm cute? Gajiel raised his eyebrow, watching as a pink magic circle appeared above Annie's open palm that faced the sky. Illusion make, at last, ladies and gentlemen. Chapati screamed in his microphone as enthusiastic as he was on the first day. This is the final day of Grand Magic Games. He paused, waiting for crowds cheering and clapping to stop before he continued. For today's special guest is a well-known figure. Would you greet Games mascot Mr. Cabo? The crowd cheered again while Cabo leaned forward towards his microphone. Good day to you all, Cabo. Today, the winner of Grand Magic Games, the #1 guild in Whole Fury, will be decided. Let's look at current placement of the guilds. Lacrima lit in the sky, showing the points of each guild in curvy letters. 1. Fairy Tail 51 Part 2. Sabretooth 50 PT3. Mermaid Heel 44 PT4. Blue Pegasus 38 PT5. Lamia Scale 36 Part 6. Quattro Puppy 32 point. And before we begin, I believe we have to greet these 6 marvelous teams. On 6th place, Fierce Hounds of Hell, Quattro Puppy. Will they be able to climb on top and make a comeback? Wild, Quattro Puppy team bellowed in the union as they came to the stadium, bathing in the cheers the crowd produced at the sight of them. Next, we have Lamia Scale. Leon waved to the crowd, Jura beside him and rest of the team behind. Will you greet Blue Pegasus? Ichia was quick to pose before the crowd as he and his team walked out. They might be in 3rd place, but their beauty is unbeatable. Mermaid Heel. Kagura had her face blank and back tense as she walked out, but Miliana and rest of her team made up for her stoicism more than enough as they waved to the crowd and jumped in the air. They held 1st place since Grand Magic Games were founded. Will they be able to take it this year as well, or will they have to satisfy with 2nd place? I present to you Sabretooth. The Sabretooth looked ready to draw blood as they stepped out with Minerva in the middle. They put their game faces. Alright, Yujima chuckled. Chapati smiled before he continued. They were the best since their founding, losing their title 7 years ago. They rose from the ashes greater than ever. One would say friendliest, but I would say scariest guild in Fury, Fairy Tail. Natsu stepped out of the shadows of the entrance of the arena, hands deep in his coat's pockets. Mira and Jalal stood closest to him, Urza and Laxus slightly behind. As they came to a stop, lightning cracked through the clear sky. For a brief moment, symbol of Fairy Tail decorated the sky, leaving the crowd in awe. Laxus grinned smugly while Urza smirked. Nice detail. We need to make a nice entrance. This is probably the strongest team Fairy Tail ever formed, Laxus replied. And it was obvious that mages around them were all well aware of that fact as they looked at the group of 5, tense and uneasy. Yujima grinned. We maybe saw them yesterday, but they still take my breath. All of the mages below do. Young and powerful. A combination not too many can brag about. I agree with that completely, Cabo. The short pumpkin man grinned. Chapati nodded in agreement as he continued with his announcement. For the last day, we prepared something special. Even as he was saying that, teams in the arena disappeared in a fashion of a teleportation spell, quickly disappearing, looking almost like static, much to crowd's amazement. 6 lacrimas appeared in the sky not long after that, showing every guild standing on deserted streets of Crocus. Today, the whole Crocus is their playground. Chapati exclaimed excitedly. Now that's disorienting, Laxus muttered as he looked around, his teammates curiously gazing at their surroundings. Where the heck are we? The lightning mage wondered. Natsu shrugged. Somewhere in Crocus. It's part of the game, it seems. You will run around the city, and when you meet your enemy the fight will start. Chapati's voice was still clearly heard, but the source of it was unknown. If your enemy loses consciousness or is unable to fight, your guild automatically gains a point. Also, and listen carefully now, each team will decide the leader, but other teams won't know who the leader is. If you defeat the leader, your guild gets 5 points. A smile passed Chapati's lips. The max points you can get are 45, so basically, any guild has a chance to win. We have to win, Urza stated. Was there ever any doubt we won't? Jalal asked with a smile that made Scarlet Requip Mage blush. I wish you all good luck. Fighting you will be remembered, losing you will be champions, winning you will be legends. Let the final day of Grand Magic Games begin. The sound of a gong echoed across Crocus and teams sprung into action all around the blooming capital. Humans sure have found new ways to entertain themselves since I was last among them, Igneal commented as he appeared beside Makarov in a burst of flames, almost making the small master falling from the railings he was sitting on. Lord Igneal, nice of you to join news. Mavis grinned at the Dragon King in human form, who nodded his head with a grin of his own. Makarov blinked in wonder as he looked from Mavis to the dragon and then back. You knew he would come here? Of course, I knew, Mavis replied. I asked him to come. Igneal looked at Makarov. I hope I'm not intruding. Makarov gulped unconsciously as he eyed the man beside him. Despite the fact he hid his magic, it was obviously there, and he knew without a doubt no human would ever match it. No, of course not, Third replied quickly when he realized Igneal was still waiting for the answer. If you don't mind me asking. Makarov noticed from the corner of his eye the rest of his children moved away from the dragon when he appeared, every last one of them on guard but still cheering from the top of their lungs along with the crowd. Where is Acnologia? Igneal's grin didn't disappear nor subsided since he appeared, and it started to unnerve the master. Acnologia, he's around. Realizing he won't get anything else out of the dragon, he looked back at the lacrima, frowning when he noticed something was not right. Since when can Jalal use lightning? Biska was the one who asked, obviously noticing along with everyone else that something was not right. Maviz's eyes glinted as she grinned slyly. The strategy has to be perfect, and in the way things are going it would appear my skills haven't gotten rusty. Makarov's eyes widened, black orbs fixed on the petite blonde. Natsu might not use illusions in a fight, but making a disguise seems like something he can do extremely well. Wait. Are you saying? Makarov gasped. We are watching Laxus, not Jalal, Mavis replied. Not that anyone else will know that until it's too late. They won't know what hit them, Macau realized. They won't know who hit them, the first corrected. And even if they manage to realize what's going on, Natsu will switch their appearance, and it will stay that way until he's knocked unconscious or runs his magic container dry, and we all know how unlikely is that to happen. Mavis's smile disappeared, her face serious as she looked at Lacrima that showed Mira with a sword in her hands. Only 0.01% to be exact. Ready? Natsu asked once the gong sounded. The rest of the team nodded, and the end of Dragon's lips twitched up for a second before they separated, each moving in their own direction. Natsu spared a glance at small floating lacrima in the air behind him, knowing full well it transmitted his picture to the people at the stadium, and as he rounded a corner he softly whispered. Illusion make. Stranger's face. When lacrima came around the corner, Laxus stared back and the blonde mage sprinted away, following the sound of a fight only a few blocks away. Members of Quattro Puppy and Blue Pegasus stared back at him in shock. Rocker and Eve exchanged a worried look, and Eve took a step away from Rocker, his intention clear. What do we have here? Chapati asked in wonder. It would seem these two know the danger they are facing and have decided to fight together. Isn't that against the rules? Ujima looked confused. Not at all. Cabo, you take his right, I his left. Eve asked with raised eyebrow, receiving a nod from Rocker. You must be quite naive if you think that will help. Laxus spoke to them, and before either of the two could blink, the dragon in disguise was standing in front of Rocker, strong hand on his throat, pushing him into the ground without a moment of pause. Eve's eyes widened in shock while Rocker stayed lying, not even a twitch coming from the mage whose head left a dent in the stone floor. Laxus rolled his neck, a loud pop echoing before he ran at Eve, who barely had enough time to bring his arms up in a block. Chaos Dragon's iron fist was the only warning he got as fist coated in black slammed into his crossed forearms, a crack of his bones clear as Laxus pushed right through his hastily made guard, sending the teen flying into the nearby building. Fairy Tale is quick and merciless when it comes to business, it would seem, Chapati commented while Laxus continued walking down the road. 2 points for fairy tale. On the other end, Mira walked down the empty street, her eyes moving to her reflection in the window, a grin spreading across her face as the pink-haired dragon stared back. This is perfect. She didn't bother running to her enemy as Jenny jumped from the roof right in front of her, Blonde's eyes widening when she found herself looking at Natsu. Shit. Mira grinned, which only seemed to make Jenny even more nervous as Blue Pegasus member took a step back. I don't think running will get you far, Natsu said as she licked her teeth, somewhat surprised when even her voice sounded different. He doesn't do things halfway, that's for sure. Jenny gulped as she shakily took a fighting stance, biting her lower lip before she spoke. Take over. Machina Soul. Blonde truly didn't expect that dragon on the other side of the street would mimic her action as his grin widened. Take over. Hellhound. Mira grinner, the incantation spoken out loud just to mess with Jenny, the shocked face of her opponent a clear sign it was worth it, and her grin turning just a tad bit sinister. White light warped around Natsu, and when it disappeared, Mira's grin could only widen when she realized the illusion was still there. Jenny didn't find it nearly as funny as Mira, it would seem, because she found herself staring at a monstrosity from children's nightmares. Natsu's skin turned gray and his skeleton seemed to get bigger under his skin as every bone on his naked torso was easily spotted. Along his spine, 3 inches long blades have grown and a long bony tail swished behind. Skull that seemed to belong to a dog or a wolf covered the top of his head, and his long pink hair was matted back, the ponytail was gone. Mira flexed her fingers, long claws instead of fingernails, making it unable to fold a fist. She bent her knees under black baggy pants that reached her knees, ready to pounce on the mage in front of her. Why, you're a takeover mage as well? Jenny all but screeched when she got over her shock. Surprise, Mira replied as she stuck out her forked tongue at her, long and sharp teeth glinting in the light. Jenny took a calming breath, unable to look away from solid black obsidian eyes she was staring at. It took only a second for Mira to move, running towards Jenny like a bullet, quickly diving under Jenny's arm that should have been a guard and bringing her leg up, slashing takeover mage over her shoulder with 2 claws that replaced her toes. Jenny cursed, pressing one hand over the wound and turning around to face Natsu, who had slipped behind her when the hit landed, only to come face to face with his helmet while Mira drove her fist into her stomach, lifting her from the ground and sending her crashing into a nearby building. Jenny barely had enough time to lift her head to look up again when Mira slammed her tail in the top of her head. Jalal had to admit even he was surprised by how real the illusions seemed, the fact they were solid even more frightening. He wondered how well Natsu understood human relationships, because he found himself staring at Urza in his reflection. He'll probably have to ask him about that later on. Look what we have here, Jalal tensed, turning to face the newcomer. His back relaxing at the sight of Jaeger. Shouldn't you be running in other direction? She asked. Jaeger grinned. Don't think I'm that easy to beat. You would be surprised how. What Jalal would be surprised over was never found out, because he slammed in Guy's head with a meteor, knocking few teeth out and rendering the man unconscious in a second. Piss off, Urza muttered. I have bigger fish to fry. Urza warped a white lock of hair around her finger, wondering how was it possible even she couldn't tell it was an illusion. Makes you wonder. She smiled before she looked up at the empty street before her. She started walking, her walk quickly turning into a jog before it turned into a full-blown sprint. Her eyes quickly falling on Hibiki and Ren, who were jogging in front of her, both quiet and tense, looking around every other moment. Hello boys, she greeted as they whipped around to face her, their mouth falling slightly open at the sight of her. Shall we dance? Urza smiled as 2 swords appeared in her hands and Requip Mage moved toward the 2 with terrifying speed and precision. Ren yelped in shock as he avoided her first strike, blocking the second by sending a gust of wind that knocked Mira from her balance, but going with the stride, Mira jumped and backflipped, one sword disappearing only to be replaced by a spear that she threw at Hibiki the moment her feet touched the ground. Hibiki moved out of the way, losing balance as he did so, but the blonde still managed to hastily cast Force Blast. Urza, not the one to be caught off guard by the spell, jumped to the side to avoid it before she exclaimed, not willing to risk one of them getting away as it might blow her cover, Requip, Black Wing Armor. Ren gaped as the white-haired woman in front of him warped in black armor, 2 bat wings spreading behind her and a long sword in her hands. Hibiki, isn't that Urza's magic? Hibiki was staring in shock at Mira, a screen appearing before him as he used archive searching for any explanation to no avail. It is, eyes on me, Urza exclaimed as she ran at Hibiki, screen in front of him disappearing and force shield flickering to life in front of him. Urza slammed with her blade in the shield, pushing Hibiki back but unable to actually push through it. With a smirk, the wings on her back swung lifting her in the air in a show of surprising speed few could match in the air. Ren moved towards her, one hand cocked back before he thrusted it forward with a yell, aerial bullet. Hand-sized sphere of compressed air flew towards Urza who folded her wings, falling below the spell before she spread them again and landed on the ground with a spin, releasing the sword in her hands that caught Ren in his side. Ren hissed in pain, his eyes moving to the long cut in the side of his waist. Ren, you alright? Hibiki asked, worry clearly attached to his voice. Ren's eyes widened as he looked at Hibiki, confirming his fears. The blonde didn't keep his eyes on their opponent, and before Ren could even warn him the butt of Mira's sword slammed into the back of Hibiki's head. Lights out, Mira said, her eyes on Hibiki for a brief moment before she looked at Ren, a small smile on her lips before she charged forward. Ren blocked the first strike and leapt out of the second, but the third hit his mark as the flat of the sword slammed into his forehead, knocking him unconscious. Laxus looked at his hands that were smaller than what he expected, and the blonde moved a hand through his hair before pulling few strands out. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of blue hair and a grin split his face. With one hand he traced the place his scar used to be, only smooth skin in his place and tattoo he knew was there. Jalal looked around, confirming what he already knew, that no one was there. He cocked his head to the side, listening for the sound of footsteps, his grin widening when he heard one 2 blocks away. His body flickered in lightning and Lightning Mage disappeared, reappearing a few moments later in front of Beth, who yelped in surprise when blue-haired mage appeared in front of her. Fairy tale, Beth whispered in shock. Just my luck, she muttered to herself a moment later. Just your luck, Laxus grinned, crossing his arms over his chest much to Beth's confusion while she took her stance. Why aren't you ready to fight? Beth questioned. Don't underestimate me, get ready to F. She stopped mid-sentence, her words catching in her throat as a spark traveled down her spine. Don't worry, Laxus smirked. It's just temporary. Beth's eyes widened as she found herself paralyzed. What did you do? She managed to ask. Lightning. Jalal shrugged as he brought one hand up, sparks dancing between his fingers. Beth couldn't even open her mouth to scream when Bolt crashed into her, knocking her unconscious. Fairy tale definitely didn't leave anything to chance, Chapati commented as they watched Beth slump to the ground. Wendy stared at Jalal, and even though she knew it was really Laxus, she couldn't help but feel guilty. The blue-haired wizard had no idea what he learned yesterday, and the more she tried to convince herself she did the right thing, the more the gnawing feeling in her stomach of something terrible was bound to happen grew. A look at Natsu only made her feel worse. It's going according to my plan, Mavis said with a smile. Now, Jalal needs to head south. There is 87% he will encounter Rufus and Rufus won't run. 91% is rather reassuring after all. Urza needs to head northwest, Mavis continued, ignoring looks of shock her guildmates sent her. 74% of chance Kagura will cross her paths with her if Urza heads in right path. Mira needs to head west and there is 81% of chance she will come face to face with Minerva. What about Jura? Makarov asked when first quieted down. He won't be easy to beat to anyone and only Natsu will be capable of that, but then Rogue and Stinger left, not to mention Orga and Bacchus, Mavis nodded. I am well aware of that. And while Laxus will deal with Orga, the chances of him meeting Orga before Sting and Rogue are only 45% and Laxus will be hard-pressed to defeat them if Orga shows up in the fight. Natsu will have to go after Jura and he will have to do it quickly because Sabretooth could do a lot of damage before we move forward. You truly deserve the name of fairy strategist, first, Makarov said to himself, earning a curious look from Igneel. Fairy strategist, Igneel mused. That's good to know. Mavis smiled, turning to look back at Lacrimas in front of them. Her eyes briefly stopping on points and number of team members that were displayed in the middle. 1. Fairy Tail 58 PT 1 liter plus 4-2. Sabretooth 52 PT 1 liter plus 4-3. Mermaid Heel 45 PT 1 liter plus 2-4. Lamia Scale 42 PT 1 liter plus 3-5. Quattro Puppy 32 PT 1 liter plus 0-6. Blue Pegasus 38 PT 0 liter plus 0. Jalal moved quietly through the streets, his eyes set on the large building in front of him. Crocus Town library was written above large doors he found himself in front of. He opened the doors, a smile tugging his lips when Rufus found Urza entering the library. "I remember you," Rufus said as he tipped his hat up. "You will surely be a worthy opponent. Maybe the best I can remember having in a long time. You have no idea," Urza replied with a smirk while Rufus frowned. "I do not remember you talking in such a manner," Jalal reminded, silent as his smirk widened. "Your memory won't do you much good now." Rufus' frown only deepened at that, but after a moment a smile passed his lips. "We will see, won't we?" Jalal tightened his muscles and brought his fists up while Rufus put his index and middle finger against his temple. "Memory. Make." The blonde mage didn't manage to finish the incantation because he was forced to leap away and jump in the air when over 20 books rose from surrounding bookshelves and rushed at him. Rufus raised an eyebrow at that as he neatly landed, his eyes fixed on Urza, whose hand was outstretched, her palm facing him. "Memorize," Rufus whispered, keeping his eyes on Jalal, who promptly disappeared in a flash of light and using meteor rushed at blonde, whose eyes widened. "That is not something I expected," Rufus commented when Jalal stopped his flight in front of him, raising his leg, ready to deliver a kick to blonde's head. "I warned you," Jalal replied while Rufus ducked under his leg and balled his fist ready to hit scarlet-haired mage in front of him in the stomach. Urza twisted out of the way and raised her elbow, catching Rufus in his ribs. Rufus backed off, jumping away to get some distance between themselves. "You have yet to draw a sword. Should I be offended? I am not to be underestimated," Rufus smiled at Jalal. Jalal smiled back as he moved red hair out of his eyes. How Urza could fight with long hair was beyond him. "Darkness magic," Jalal said, his magic turning darker, making Rufus' eyes widen yet again. Dark grab, magic danced in the air around Urza, hand taking the shape of a hand that rushed at Rufus, who leapt out of the way only for the hand to follow him, twisting and closing around his leg. "Memory. Make." Black void. Rufus quickly yelped and disappeared in a flash of gold light just when the arm around him started tightening. Jalal's eyes widened. Despite the difference in color, he had no doubt what that spell was, or better to say whose it was. "No way," Jalal breathed out. How? That's Natsu's spell. That's freaking chaotic void." Rufus reappeared few meters away from him, looking quite smug, a grin on his face. "I already told you, don't underestimate me." Makarov could only thank Ignil he didn't fall off the railing down in the arena. "I did not predict this." Mavis was just as shocked as everyone else, and that did nothing to calm Makarov's nerves. Ignil stared at the screen wide-eyed before he looked at Mavis. "You are aware just how dangerous that spell could be in this fight, yeses," Mavis said. "I'm afraid to think what else he had copied during this Grand Magic Games this year, memory molding." Levi said in amazement. "It truly is something else, the limitation of it is seemingly non-existent. Not even ice molding can take creativity to that extent," Gray muttered with a frown. Mavis nodded in agreement. "Unfortunately, that couldn't be truer. Unless Rufus has smaller reserves, this could prove troublesome, but Urza, I mean Jalal will still win, right?" Elfman asked worriedly. "Despite everything, I don't have a reason to believe otherwise at the moment, but I find myself worried," Mavis said, her eyes moving to screen next to the fight they watched until now, the screen showing Jura defeating Bachus frighteningly quickly. 1. Fairy Tale 58 PT 1 liter plus 4-2. Sabertooth 53 PT 1 liter plus 4-3. Lamia Scale 47 PT 1 liter plus 3-4. Mermaid Heel 45 PT 1 liter plus 1-5. Blue Pegasus 38 PT 0 liter plus 06. Quattro Puppy 32 PT 0 liter plus 0 inches. If someone else decides to join the fight, it will prove fatal. The fact Robe was moving toward library did not help. Jalal composed himself as quickly as possible, his eyes sharper than they were at the beginning, a clear warning ringing in his head. "Win as soon as possible. I do not remember you being capable of using darkness magic," Rufus commented idly. "Then I wasn't the only one who underestimated my opponent," Urza shot back. Rufus smiled. "No, you weren't. That being said, I do remember someone else in your guild being capable of that." Jalal tensed. "Ah, would you like to see another trick of mine? I am capable of quite a bit more than remembering," Rufus asked, two fingers resting on his temples again. "Memory. Make." Dark lightning. Rufus's magic pressure spiked for a second, momentarily turning darker, not unlike his own, and Jalal found himself watching in surprise as a hand made of shadow and lightning rushed at him. In a flash of gold, he moved out of its way with meteor. The speed of his retrieval too big for the hand to follow as it tried to turn around only to crash into bookshelves, books on it exploding in a shower of smoldering paper. Jalal moved towards Rufus, who smiled again. Memory, make, shrine of turbulent fang. The air started moving around them with speed and ferocity that soon turned the wind into towers of tornadoes that surrounded the blonde, making it impossible for Jalal to come near him unless risking of crashing into one of the imposing towers of wind. Rufus lifted his other hand and tornadoes rushed at Jalal, who cursed and quickly crossed his arms. Tornadoes crashed and dust rose, making both crowd watching the fight and Rufus to withhold their breaths. When nothing happened for several more seconds, Rufus allowed himself to smile. I have memorized you and I will remember your defeat. All you will be remembering is my victory, Jalal replied, and Rufus barely had time to widen his eyes when Jalal landed behind him using meteor and slammed his open palm on his back, a red snake circling through his hand and into Rufus, warping around him. Bind snake, Jalal finished, putting her boot on Rufus and pushing him to the ground while Rufus tried to resist the spell that paralyzed him. How? Rufus managed to ask. A combination of meteor and darkness cage that slowed tornadoes down enough for me to avoid being hit. You did rip a part of my skirt though, Urza explained, her eyes on shreds of blue skirt that reminded on her, instead of knee length, the right side now only enough to cover her. Sweat dreams, Jalal finished as he cocked his hand back and slammed it into Rufus' head, knocking the man unconscious. I must admit, you fairies continue to surprise me. Jalal's head snapped up just as Rogue exited the shadows cast by the entrance doors. 1. Fairy Tale 58 PT 1 liter plus 4-2. Sabretooth 53 PT 1 liter plus 3-3. Lamia Scale 47 PT 1 liter plus 3-4. Mermaid Heel 45 PT 1 liter plus 1-5. Blue Pegasus 38 PT 0 liter plus 06. Quattro Puppy 32 PT 0 liter plus 0 feet. This is almost disturbingly easy, Jalal commented as the small group moved through the halls of Castle's dungeons as quietly as possible. Any guard that even so much as looked at them would found themselves staring at empty air. And people say illusions were useless in combat. Annie made a small snort in amusement as they walked right past another guard. If you keep talking you'll break my illusion. There is only so much I can do to mask sound, Annie whispered to Iron Dragon Slayer. Altair sighed as the conversation among them subsided, raising one hand, her trademark orb floating above it as she did so. Yukino shouldn't be far, Altair informed her companions as she led the group to another turn. It only took them few more minutes before they reached Yukino's cell, the white-haired ex-Sabretooth member sitting on the metal bed that looked anything but comfortable. Group of 7 stared at her for a moment, neither sure what to say. In order to avoid Yukino making too much noise, and appearing out of thin air might be just the right thing to make her scream. Annie sighed as she looked at the group and turned back toward Yukino before dropping the spell that cowered her, but careful to keep the rest hidden. Yukino still jumped when she saw her but thankfully didn't make a sound. You're that fairy tale member? Yukino asked uncertainly. Annie, right? Annie smiled brightly, pleasantly surprised she was recognized as people usually only recognized brother. Yes, I am. Are you alright? Yukino blinked at the question but nodded after a moment. What are you doing here? We're here to rescue you. We can't allow Eclipse being started, and that means getting you out and finding Lucis keys is our primary concern. Wait. Annie smiled somewhat sheepishly as she straightened her red skirt while 6 members appeared behind her. Oh, Yukino gaped. There's quite a number of you. How did you pass all the guards? I'm Illusion Molder, Annie explained. Now let's go. We need to get yours and Lucis keys before we can get out. They took Lucis keys? Yukino asked in horror before she hung her head in shame. It's all my fault. Don't blame yourself for it now. There's no use in doing that, Arthur shrugged. What's done is done. Yukino nodded reluctantly before she looked at metal bars that stood in her way of freedom. You have any idea of how to get me out? Arthur grinned as he moved to the lock and placed his hand around it. Yukino watched with interest as shadows extended over the lock and entered the keyhole. It should take only a moment. He didn't manage to finish his sentence as Jalal grabbed the lock and ripped it apart with his bare hand before stuffing it in his mouth. You're too slow, Souleater Jr., Arthur's eye twitched as the doors screeched open. My last name's Smith, Not Souleater, whatever, Gajeel grumbled while the two teenagers stepped aside so Yukino could step out. Thanks for getting me out. Thank us once we're out of castle, Lily advised with a smirk. I'll do it again, Yukino smiled pleasantly. It was probably that kind of things you say just before everything went wrong. Most of the fairy tale members mused when the floor beneath them opened, not a corridor further when they moved quickly towards upper floors. Group of 8 crashed into the cold dry dirt a good deal further from the hole above them, and they could only watch as it closed behind them. Now that's unfortunate, Arthur mused before he turned to Gajeel, deadpan expression on his face as he stated bluntly. I blame you. Gajeel spluttered in shock for a second before he scowled fiercely. How is this my fault? You made too much noise breaking that lock, Annie agreed, smiling when Gajeel leveled her with a glare. Years around Natsu certainly helped the two young teenagers becoming immune to quite a number of glares. Do any of you have any idea where we are? Happy asked, looking around, barely seeing few meters in front of him due to the poor light. The only source was, after all, the roof above them and minimal amount that filtered through the cracks. Altair shook her head as she raised her palm, the orb floating above it again as the light emitted from it, casting light on the cavern they found themselves in. Yukino blinked at the sudden light before she looked at Altair in amazement. How are you doing that? Time arc, Altair smirked. I'm reflecting the light that in the past fell on the orb. Amazing, Yukino breathed out, but before she could comment much further on it, a female disembodied voice echoed around the walls. Welcome to the Pitfall Palace. The last stretch of freedom for criminals such as yourselves. But I would advise against celebrating. No one ever managed to get out of this place. Woman's figure appeared in front of them, but her constant buzzing in and out of focus told them of a poorly executed thought projection. Guards behind green-haired woman stood still, but neither of them any more solid looking. Your bones will rot here, thieves, so pray for your death to come quickly, the woman finished and her picture disappeared again. She couldn't take it, she felt downright sick and it took all her willpower to stay standing straight. Wendy gritted her teeth and tightened her grip on the railing. She'll tell Natsu at the end of the day. The battle Carla saw shouldn't happen today, probably. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. The next part will be out soon.